Okay, well, my name is Henry Stanier. I'm the Monitoring and Research Officer for the Wildlife Trust of the Great Fen. And this year's already been quite an interesting year. As you can see here, this is the Great Fen, the northern tip looking towards Yaxley with Home Fen at the top left. And this is a bit earlier in the year when we actually had a bit of snow, but you can see some of the water out in the Great Fen and how much we've actually got. Obviously, as many of you know, we've had a great drainage of the fens over the years. We've lost over 99% since 1600. And so this has only really left us with a few fragments, some well-known sites from Chippenham Fen, Home Fen, Wycombe Fen, Woodwalton Fen, with obviously the idea of the Great Fen encapsulating those two national nature reserves of Home Fen and Woodwalton Fen in the former site of Whittlesea Mere. It's one of the living landscape projects of the Wildlife Trust. And if you haven't been already, we're south of Peterborough and north of Huntingdon with the East Coast Main Line down our western boundary. One of the most interesting parts of the Great Fen is, of course, Whittlesea Mere. This is a map of the Great Fen project area. And there you go, there superimposed on the top is Whittlesea Mere, a big inland shallow lake, which would have come up right to the edge of what is now Home Fen National Nature Reserve. It was over 750 hectares in the summer and probably double that in the winter when it was in full flood. But sadly, it was drained in 1862, and you can still see the remains of it today. It is still there, and you'll see that on most maps if you look closely. We go back in time and look at some of the records from those days. There's some very interesting stuff. There's things like common hawker, which has now disappeared from the area. A record there from 1900 from Whittlesea Mere. But also interestingly, as you can see here, one of my pictures of a black darter from Whittlesea Mere by a particular gentleman by the name of Jennings. Now, he was very active in the 1800s in Cambridgeshire in gathering records, and you'll hear more about him from Matt Hayes later on. But there were other naturalists in the area gathering information, and by the 1800s, you can see this is what the area looked like. The meres were still there in 1840, but you can see a lot of the land surrounding it was actually pasture by then. There you go, there's the outlines of the two national nature reserves, again with Home Fen and Woodwalton Fen, Home Fen right up against the edge of Whittlesea Mere. It's also interesting, you can see Trundle Mere, the lesser known of the meres, on the west-hand side of Whittlesea Mere. Of course, the Rothschilds were something you have to mention when it comes to dragonflies, and Huntingdonshire, Great Fen. Obviously, Charles Rothschild was one of the forerunners of conservation in this country, keen naturalist and entomologist, as was his daughter Miriam, who lived at Ashton Wold. And in 1910, he bought Woodwalton Fen, put a bungalow on it that perhaps some of you would like to come and see later this year, and started what is now basically the Wildlife Trusts. And produced that very famous list of land suitable for nature reserves in 1915, many of which are still nature reserves across the whole of the country today. I look back in other forms of information, and some of you may have come across the Victorian county histories for the country. In 1926, Peake wrote the one for Huntingdonshire, and he included not a huge amount about dragonflies, but a reasonable amount. And certainly he noticed then that the fens were a fantastic place for dragonflies, but very little of the true fen still remained. However, he did highlight the fact that there was this great system of drains and ditches throughout the area, which was really the reservoir for a lot of aquatic invertebrates, including the dragonflies. And he also noted one of my favorite dragonflies, the banded demoiselle, as being present in huge numbers along the River Ouse, close to where I actually live now. So these records are very useful for looking back in the past and seeing who's been gathering data. And another, shall we say, giant of dragonfly study is, of course, Norman Moore. And you can see that he moved into the area in the 1960s. And you can see here some of his early records from Woodwalton Fen. Now, Norman, of course, did a lot of work in the area on the national nature reserves based out of Monk's Wood. And some of his early work, starting in 1961, is when the experimental ponds were constructed at the southern end of Woodwalton Fen. These ponds he spent many, many years actually studying, all 20 of them in the southwest corner of Woodwalton Fen, each one about 19, 20 meters in circumference, about a couple of meters apart or more, seeing how dragonflies colonized such habitats. Of course, these ponds are still there today. This photograph was only taken a couple of years ago by myself. And what's not so well known is there were other ponds dug at Woodwalton as well from his influence. You can see here on the picture the 20 experimental ponds on the left, but also in an area called the Heathfield, he, along with the then warden Gordon Mason, dug 3 more ponds between 1974 and 77. And these also were subject to his study, particularly in terms of colonization of dragonflies and movement, and seeing how close a network of SSSI should be in the country to make them an effective network for nature. Those ponds are also still there. This is Pond A, the southernmost of the ponds, amongst Sweetgale, or some of you know as bog myrtle. It's still there, certainly was there on Monday, and as you can see, getting ready for what hopefully will be a productive dragonfly year this year. That's the most northerly of the ones, a bit more open than the previous one, but all still in good condition. By 2001, things were really getting going in project area, because the big idea it was then called came together with a number of partners, the local Wildlife Trust, Natural England, middle-level commissioners responsible for draining the fens, Huntingdon District Council and the Environment Agency, all to think about what they could do in this area. And they decided to create a living landscape over 3,700 hectares in size, basically 3 miles across and nearly 7 miles long. And it was a mosaic of habitats, fen and fen edge habitats, not just wetland, but also woodland, scrub, and very importantly, wet grassland. And to link those 2 national nature reserves over a long time scale, but it did involve buying an awful lot of land. Not long before other people came in on the act, the Dragonfly project moved house basically and came over to Woodwalton Fen. One of the other objectives of the Great Fen is well-being, and I can't think of a better photograph to show that shows well-being, enjoying a summer full of dragonflies with Henry Curry on the left here, Parfit, Alan Nelson, and of course, Rory Mackenzie Dodds. There's something about studying dragonflies and the hats, as you can see here. Other people obviously came along to visit, and this is of course the late, great Philip Corbett as well, beside Rory and Harry Koenigswater. So obviously the Great Fen attracted a lot of attention, and things started to progress quite quickly, certainly from 2002, when an extension was purchased for Woodwalton Fen at Darlow's farm. More land was built, 2005 was an extension of Home Fen, and yet more land being purchased over time, bringing us up towards present day. So it really cracked on quite quickly. I've been working for the Trust for several years at that point, but in 2015, I came over to focus exclusively on the Great Fen. And interestingly, one of my first dragonflies I saw was a common darter, a very late common darter, something that's becoming obviously increasingly common these days. Within a year, we had some exciting news. Obviously, dragonflies are excellent colonizers, and we had our very first willow emerald damselfly spotted by Rona Watson, again at Woodwalton Fen, just at the entrance over the bridge. And since then, they've spread quite rapidly. Both Woodwalton Fen is a regular spot to see the willow emeralds, but now also Home Fen is as well. It's really quite common to see them knocking around in Home Fen, particularly at the northern end, if you decide to go from the Home Fen posts and head up to Trundlemere Lookout, the hide that looks over what used to be Trundlemere. Home Fen is another of the jewels in the crown of the Great Fen, a rather large natural nature reserve, over 250 hectares, a mixture of heathland, a lot of birch woodland, but also some quite acidic areas, being the area of the old raised bog historically, and also some nice ditches. And there you go. That was only, I think, a couple of years ago, we're photographing willow emeralds quite commonly along some of the main old drains that go through Home Fen. Well, by 2017, a lot of progress has been made with the Great Fen. Thanks to the lottery, we've got a lot of money, some of the biggest chunks of money for a conservation project, and owned over 2,000 hectares, of which over 1,200 were under restoration. And if you add the national nature reserves, that takes us up to 1,700. More people are interested in coming along. Some of you may have attended the 2017 International Oceanological Congress. They came along to come and see dragonflies in Cambridge and the local sites such as the Great Fen and Wicken Fen. And it was nice to see people so enthusiastic for dragonflies from around the world. There was one particular person who'd studied the DNA of brown hawkers for many years, actually based in North America, had never actually seen one, a very characteristic dragonfly of the fens, and great excitement when someone spotted their first blue-tailed damselfly. It was also the year we started to get records of beautiful demoiselle in the Great Fen. We're only 4 miles from the centre of Peterborough, another place well known for beautiful demoiselle records. And so it just shows you, obviously, that, as we all know, dragonflies can, when they want to, travel quite big distances. And this was just one example of how things are changing in our local dragonfly fauna. In terms of demonstrating the sort of work that we've done in the Great Fen over the years, this is a photograph back in 2000, just before the project started, at the northern end of the Great Fen from Google Earth. You can see Home Fen there in the bottom left-hand corner. And by 2018, we'd really increased the number of water bodies, new ditches, new surface grips and scrapes, very shallow water surfaces for the spring and early summer. Most of them not with fishing, obviously making it very, very useful for colonization of dragonflies and other invertebrates to do so successfully. Further scrapes and pools have been dug since then. You can see this is the Trundlemere Lookout that I mentioned earlier on the corner of Home Fen, and that was a brand new scrape dug out at the end of 2018. And by 2019, as the water levels rose naturally, you could see here, very quickly full of water. And it doesn't take long for dragonflies to move in, as we well know, to colonize these water bodies, just as this pair of common darters. To be fair, common darters seem to be overwhelmed these days by numbers of ruddy darters that we're picking up in the Great Fen, which are becoming more and more common every year. This sort of information has been gathered by our excellent team of staff and volunteers in the Great Fen, and certainly in the last few years, we've expanded the number of dragonfly transects. Although the characteristic pollard work was originally developed for dragonflies, but these days a lot of people associate the pollard walk with butterflies. A few years ago, we decided to start a project where we did basically dragonfly and butterfly transects at the same time, a combined species recording system. And it's developed a lot of good data for us, as you can see here, from many sites across the Great Fen. 2019 was a very good year for dragonflies in many ways. There were lots of records coming in from all sorts of places, as Duncan mentioned earlier. Southern migrant hawker in Cambridge, only 16 miles away, one that we haven't yet got in the Great Fen, but surely it can't be too long. Migrant hawkers obviously have got their own success story and are very numerous in the Great Fen. And as you can see here, the differences between the two. When you've got one of these whizzing past you, you're not necessarily going to realise that you might have a southern migrant rather than a migrant hawker. So hopefully, fingers crossed, maybe this year. And then there's a Norfolk hawker as well, another record turning up in the Great Fen in 2019. And again, a species not very far away. Paxton Pits is only 8 miles south. And so it's not surprising this species, which is expanding its range in other parts of the country, is hopefully going to do so in the future. Well, Wood Walton Fen in 2019 actually came under the ownership of the local wildlife trust. Real big benefit and something we're really happy about. But obviously still managed by Natural England. And also in 2019, the then warden, site manager, Alan Bowley, published his new book, The Great Fen, A Journey Through Time, initially focused on Wood Walton, but then expanding to include all of the Great Fen. It's well worth having a read through that to find out more about the history of the Great Fen. Well, at the end of 2019, we applied for money from the People's Postcode Lottery to start a new project at the Great Fen. This was funded by Waterworks, People and Project, part of the Postcode Dream Trust. And the idea was to show what farming could be like in the fens if we let it get wet, as it was trying to do for hundreds, if not thousands of years, rather than trying to drain it. And also to develop the whole area of the fens and see whether we could set it up as a UNESCO Fens biosphere. But the wet farming project has really cracked on and been very exciting for us. The crops that we're hoping to plant include things like bulrush, which we're very familiar with, common reed, but also sphagnum and other species such as Glyceria fluitans, the floating sweetgrass. This project started on the ground in 2020 in February, when the test beds at the Great Fen were under construction by fen ditching. But of course, last year, what happened? COVID, and everything had to grind to a halt. Well, fortunately, things changed by May. So although we lost April in terms of recording last year, we did start back into the field using COVID restrictions, which we followed rigorously, going out into the Great Fen, which admittedly a lot of the area is just for wildlife. And so you're out there on your own, away from everyone else. It's a perfect situation to go out and do field work. And last year, I started a new project, actually looking at great crested newts and using a piece of equipment called the Dewsbury trap, which you can see here, which is basically a bit like a lobster pot stuck in the water with a bag on top, which leaves it with an area of air at the top so that when the newts go in through the mesh entrance, they can still pop up inside to the surface to breathe. Now, this was quite interesting for me because other work had been done, for example, at the experimental ponds of Norman Moor on newts since then, and we do have great crested newts in a number of places. But I was more interested in what else these traps could catch, and they are actually excellent at catching the larger invertebrates. This was just one trap from one of the Norman Moor ponds in the Heathfield area, and you can see it's full of beetles here, quite a few different species of great diving beetle as well, the ones with the black and yellow undersides of the wasp diving beetle. We also were picking up things like the king diving beetle, that Fenland specialist. We also spot here at the bottom dragonfly larvae, And I have been able to collect records of quite a few damsel and dragonflies using this message, such as this particular one, which is the brown hawker dragonfly. So I'll be doing a lot more of that this year. Obviously, dragonflies move in very, very quickly. They colonize and they're not always picked up, but using work to look at the larvae in exuvia, which some of you know is one of my specialities, is very valuable for gathering data. 2020 also seemed to be a very good year for scarce chasers. I'd newly moved house near to the Ouse, and in my little village, my first dragonfly I recorded in my ponds in my back garden actually was the scarce chaser. Now, a lot of people recorded scarce chasers in new places last year. This is obviously the male with the lovely steely blue eyes. By July last year, the test beds had finally been completed for the wet farming project, and then it just involved us starting to wet them up. At the same time, we were running invertebrate surveys to give us a baseline. And as you can see here, this is work done by Pete and Chris Kirby, the local entomologists, and a good range of species on site, including 13 species of dragonflies and a range of other invertebrates as well, some of which are nationally scarce, including, of course, nationally scarce chaser, which obviously seems to be doing its best not to become nationally scarce anymore. Dragonflies do have it all their own way in the area, but although we do have a lot of hobbies at the Great Fen, we have a great range of birds of prey, and this particular kestrel over in the area of the test beds seem to be developing a very effective hunting mechanism for polishing off some of the larger dragonflies. The planting of the test beds continues with a lot of voluntary contributions, over 50,000 plants put in over 10 weeks. So many thanks to all the different people who came out, including our Huntingdon local group of the Wildlife Trust. And that sort of work really just gives you a great deal of job satisfaction. So that's what it looks like by the end of 2020. The ditches wetted up so that we have water within about 10 centimetres of the surface, and a great range of plants planted up. The top is where the water comes in, where the bulrush and the reed bed is to filter the water, and then comes through other crops, as you can see here, from bulrush, common reed, the sweetgrass I mentioned, to other crops that have their uses, the yellow iris, cuckoo flower, watercross, and something we're yet to plant, the sphagnum. But what else happened last year? Well, we had the floods. And this is what Woodwalton Fen looked like in December 2020. You can see here Woodwalton at the top of the picture amongst the trees there. You're looking from the west side, looking over the west bank, and it's pretty much inundated. Many years ago, to help preserve Woodwalton Fen, it was organised so that in times of exceptional flood, the water would overtop to create a reservoir against flooding in the surrounding farmland. But as you'd appreciate, because of climate change, our weather is becoming more and more extreme, and these flood events are happening more and more. In the foreground, on the left, is actually the new purchased land of Middle Farm, which is actually designed to take this sort of water. But the water on the left in the fields at Middle Farm is actually just rainwater building up from slow drainage off the site, whereas the water coming onto Woodwalton Fen at the top is actually water coming out of the main drains, which obviously have issues with phosphates and other chemicals that we don't really want in the future on our National Nature Reserve. As it turned out, a lot of work was being done at that time on the bridges in Woodwalton Fen, and so those floods, which were quite extreme in December, actually took out quite a lot of the internal bridges, which is why Woodwalton Fen is actually closed at the moment for repairs, though hopefully it will open sometime next month. Those of you who were paying attention to the water levels again, in 2021, the start of this year, we had yet more water. But elsewhere in the Great Fen, we're actually keeping it in to actually keep the water levels high for wildlife. And so views like this greeted us. This is again looking over Rhymes Rebed at the northern part of the Great Fen. That's Home Fen on the left, those trees, and you'll just spot Trundlemere Lookout, the hide, at the tip of those trees, looking out over the northern tip of Rhymes Rebed, looking towards what would have once been the area of Trundlemere, next to Whittlesea Mere. But we've still been active, and last year we dug out yet more ponds and scrapes. These are two by the rookery that stand of old poplars by the road that goes north from Home Fen. So if you do go up there this year, when it's safe to do so, you'll look round the corner of the plantation and you'll see these new scrapes. They're quite big, and so we're hoping that they'll attract a lot of dragonflies, but again, they're not connected to the river in any way. This one's just filled up naturally by water. We've used LiDAR, laser directed finding imaging, and also drone photography to work out what the water levels are, as well as dip wells to calculate how deep we want to dig these water bodies to allow them to have water at just the right time. So what else will we get? Maybe this year is the year we'll get southern migrant hawker. But the roll call at the moment for the Great Fen is about 24 species. It's a good range of species. Hopefully, the lesser emperors that turn up quite regularly over towards Cambridge will eventually turn up. Who knows, they might have been, we just haven't spotted them. And of course, the southern migrant hawker as well. But we're doing well, and we're set up for these great colonizers to just drop in and set up home. So if you're interested in coming out, hopefully by July, things will have returned to some form of normality, and I'll be leading some walks out of the Rothschild bungalow at Woodwalton Fen on the weekend of the 17th and 18th of July. I'll also be doing an introductory course one evening in the coming months on dragonflies as well, if you want to check out our website. But do come and have a visit to the Great Fen, and in particular Woodwalton Fen and the Rothschild bungalow. And as you look very closely, you'll see here the concrete posts have the different levels marked on them of the floods that have happened over the years. And of course, this year, there we go, December 2020, the level actually got over the December 1954 floods, which on the main picture is just there. So I look forward to seeing up you at some time. Thanks very much.